The winter of 1847 was one of the harshest anyone could remember in the Nebraska Territory. Snow fell thick and heavy for weeks, covering the prairie in a white blanket that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The wind howled day and night, carrying with it a bitter cold that seemed to freeze everything it touched. Thomas Mitchell was only 12 years old, but he had already learned what it meant to survive on the frontier. His family had moved west from Ohio 3 years earlier, seeking better land and a fresh start. Their small farms sat alone on the vast prairie, miles from the nearest neighbor. The farmhouse was simple but sturdy. Built by Thomas's father with thick wooden walls to keep out the cold, behind the house stood a large red barn where they kept their animals and stored hay for the winter. Thomas was the eldest of 4 children. His younger siblings looked up to him, and his parents often relied on his help with the daily chores. Despite his young age, he had developed a strong sense of responsibility and compassion that would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. On a particularly cold February morning, Thomas was feeding the chickens when he heard a strange sound coming from the direction of the creek that ran near their property. It was a low moaning, almost like the wind, but different somehow. He stopped what he was doing and listened carefully. There it was again. Curious and concerned, Thomas grabbed his heavy winter coat and made his way through the deep snow toward the sound. The creek was frozen solid, and the bare trees along its banks looked like dark skeletons against the white landscape. As he got closer, he could see something dark lying near the water's edge. When Thomas reached the spot, his heart nearly stopped. There, lying in the snow, was a young Indian girl who appeared to be about his own age. She was barely conscious, her lips blue from the cold, and her breathing was shallow and labored. She wore traditional Native American clothing, but it was thin and provided little protection against the harsh weather. Her long black hair was frozen with ice crystals, and her dark eyes looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Thomas had been taught to be wary of Indians. The stories told by other settlers often painted them as dangerous enemies. But looking down at this dying child, he saw not an enemy but another human being in desperate need of help. Without hesitation, he knelt down beside her. The girl tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas could see that she was very sick, burning with fever despite being nearly frozen. He knew he had to act quickly. He carefully lifted the girl in his arms, surprised by how light she felt. She was clearly malnourished and weak. As Thomas carried the girl toward his family's farmhouse, his mind raced with questions. Where had she come from? How long had she been lying by the creek? Was she part of a larger group? But these questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting her warm and trying to save her life. When Thomas burst through the front door of the farmhouse carrying the Indian girl, his mother, Mary Mitchell, gasped in shock. His father, John, immediately stood up from the table where he had been reading his Bible. Thomas, what have you done? His father asked, his voice filled with concern and confusion. I found her by the creek, Pa, Thomas said, breathing hard from the effort of carrying the girl through the snow. She's dying. We have to help her. Mary Mitchell's maternal instincts overcame any fear or prejudice she might have felt. She quickly cleared the kitchen table and helped Thomas lay the girl down. The child was unconscious now, her breathing even more labored than before. John, bring me every blanket we have, Mary said to her husband, and stoke the fire. We need to get her warm. Thomas watched as his parents worked to help the girl. His mother removed the wet, frozen clothing and wrapped the child in warm, dry blankets. His father built up the fire until the small farmhouse was filled with heat. Thomas's younger siblings, awakened by the commotion, peered down from the loft where they slept. For hours, the Mitchell family took turns caring for the Indian girl. Mary spooned warm broth between her lips, while John and Thomas kept the fire burning bright. The girl's fever was high, and she often spoke in her native language during moments when she was partly conscious. Thomas felt a special connection to this mysterious child. He had been the one to find her, to bring her to safety. He stayed by her side throughout the day, gently holding her hand and talking to her softly, even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. As evening approached, the girl's condition seemed to worsen. Her breathing became more irregular, and her fever spiked even higher. Mary Mitchell shook her head sadly as she felt the child's forehead. "I don't think she's going to make it through the night," she whispered to her husband. Thomas overheard his mother's words, and his heart filled with determination. He looked down at the girl, so peaceful yet so close to death, wrapped in the family's warmest blankets. Then he remembered something his grandmother had given him before they left Ohio. It was a special quilt she had made by hand, created from pieces of fabric that held memories of their family's history. Some squares came from his grandfather's work shirts, others from dresses his grandmother had worn to church. It was the most precious thing Thomas owned, something he treasured above all his other possessions. Without saying a word to his parents, Thomas climbed up to the loft where he slept. He pulled the beautiful quilt from his bed and carried it back down to where the Indian girl lay. Gently, he placed his grandmother's quilt over her, adding its warmth to the other blankets that already covered her. The quilt seemed to make a difference. The girl's breathing became more steady, and her fever appeared to break slightly. Thomas smiled. Feeling that he had done the right thing, he settled into a chair beside her and prepared to keep watch through the night, unaware that his simple act of kindness was about to change everything. Thomas dozed fitfully in the chair beside the Indian girl throughout the long, cold night. Every few minutes, he would wake to check on her breathing and adjust the blankets, including his precious grandmother's quilt. Sometime near dawn, he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. His father stood behind him, holding a cup of hot coffee. "You've done good, son," John Mitchell said quietly. "Her breathing is stronger now." Thomas looked down at the girl and saw that his father was right. The blue color had left her lips, and she seemed to be resting more peacefully. The fever had broken during the night, and for the first time since he found her, Thomas felt hopeful that she might survive. As the first light of morning crept through the farmhouse windows, the girl's eyes slowly opened. She looked confused and frightened until her gaze fell upon Thomas. Something in his kind young face seemed to reassure her, and she managed a weak smile. "Water," she whispered in broken English. Mary Mitchell quickly brought a cup of cool water, and Thomas helped lift the girl's head so she could drink. She was still very weak, but the fact that she was conscious and able to speak gave everyone hope. "What is your name?" Thomas asked gently. "Ayana," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Means eternal blossom." Thomas smiled. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm Thomas." Ayana tried to sit up, but she was too weak. Thomas noticed her looking at the quilt that covered her, and he saw wonder in her eyes as she touched the colorful fabric with her thin fingers. "This is yours?" she asked. "It was my grandmother's," Thomas said. "But I want you to have it. It helped make you better." Ayana's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "Too precious. Cannot take." "Please," Thomas insisted. "My grandmother would want someone who needed it to have it." Before Ayana could respond, John Mitchell, who had been standing guard at the window, suddenly tensed. "Mary," he called to his wife, his voice tight with concern. "Come look at this." Thomas and his mother hurried to the window, and what they saw made their blood run cold. In the distance, emerging from the tree line near the creek, were dozens of mounted Native American warriors. They moved slowly and deliberately across the snowy prairie toward the farmhouse, their horses' breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. "Dear Lord," Mary whispered, instinctively pulling Thomas closer to her. More warriors continued to appear from the trees. Thomas counted 20, then 50, then gave up counting as the number continued to grow. They were dressed for war, with painted faces and carrying weapons. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. John Mitchell reached for his rifle, but then paused. He was vastly outnumbered, and any show of aggression might doom his entire family. "Get the other children down here," he told his wife. "We need to stay together." As the warriors drew closer, Thomas could see that they belonged to the same tribe as Ayana. Their leader, a tall man with gray hair and stern features, rode at the front of the group. Thomas guessed there were now close to 700 warriors surrounding their small farmhouse and barn. "They've come for her," Thomas said, looking back at Ayana. The Indian girl had managed to prop herself up on her elbows and was looking toward the window. When she saw the warriors, tears began flowing down her cheeks. "My people," she whispered. "They search for me." "Are you a chief's daughter?" Thomas asked. Ayanna nodded weakly. "Father is Chief Running Bear. I ran away during storm. Was angry about arranged marriage to warrior I do not love. Got lost. Became sick. Almost died." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had rescued the daughter of a powerful chief, and now hundreds of warriors were outside his home. He didn't know whether they had come to thank him or to punish him for touching their chief's daughter. The sound of horses grew louder as the warriors formed a large circle around the Mitchell farmstead. They made no aggressive moves, but their mere presence was intimidating enough. Some dismounted and began setting up what appeared to be a temporary camp in the snow. John Mitchell made a difficult decision. He handed his rifle to his wife and slowly opened the front door of the farmhouse. The bitter cold rushed in immediately, but he stepped outside with his hands visible and empty. "I am John Mitchell," he called out in a strong voice. "I come in peace." The warriors remained silent and still. Then the gray-haired leader urged his horse forward until he was only a few yards from the farmhouse. When he spoke, his English was clear and commanding. "I am Chief Running Bear," he announced. "My daughter is missing 3 days. Tracks lead here. Your daughter is inside," John replied honestly. "My son found her dying by the creek. We have cared for her through the night." Chief Running Bear's expression remained stern, but Thomas thought he detected a flicker of relief in the man's eyes. "You will bring her out. She is very weak," John said. "She nearly died from cold and fever." "Bring her out," the chief repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. John nodded and returned to the farmhouse. The entire Mitchell family was now gathered around Ayanna, who was trying to stand despite her weakness. "I must go to them," she said. "They will not leave until they see me safe." Thomas helped her to her feet, and Mary Mitchell wrapped additional blankets around the girl's shoulders. Ayanna clutched Thomas's grandmother's quilt tightly to her chest. "Keep the quilt," Thomas said firmly. "Remember our friendship." Ayanna smiled through her tears and squeezed Thomas's hand. "I will never forget, boy who saved my life." Together, the Mitchell family helped Ayanna walk slowly toward the front door. Thomas's younger siblings clustered around their parents, frightened but trying to be brave. As they stepped outside into the bitter cold, Thomas was amazed by the sight that greeted them. The 700 warriors had arranged themselves in perfect formation around the farmstead. Their horses stood quietly in the snow, and every warrior sat motionless, watching the scene unfold. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of wind across the prairie. Chief Running Bear dismounted and walked toward his daughter. When he saw how weak she was, his stern expression softened slightly. Ayanna took faltering steps toward her father, still clutching the colorful quilt. "Father," she said in her native language, "these people saved my life." The chief looked at Thomas and his family with new eyes. He could see the kindness in their faces and the genuine care they had shown for his daughter. He also noticed the beautiful quilt that Ayanna held so protectively. "You gave this to my daughter?" he asked Thomas directly. Thomas nodded, feeling very small under the chief's intense gaze. "She was cold. It was my grandmother's, but Ayanna needed it more." Chief Running Bear studied the boy for a long moment. Then he spoke to his warriors in their own language. The entire gathering of 700 men began to murmur among themselves, and Thomas wondered if he had somehow made a terrible mistake. But instead of anger, he saw something unexpected in the chief's eyes. It was respect, and perhaps even gratitude. The tension that had filled the air began to shift. Though Thomas still didn't know what would happen next, Chief Running Bear continued to study Thomas with those penetrating dark eyes. The silence stretched on until Thomas began to wonder if he should speak. But his father's gentle hand on his shoulder warned him to wait. Finally, the chief spoke again. But this time, his voice carried a different tone entirely. "In our tribe," Chief Running Bear said slowly, "there is an old saying. The true measure of a person is found not in what they take, but in what they give when they have little to spare." He looked down at the colorful quilt in his daughter's arms. You gave my daughter your most precious possession to save her life. Thomas felt his cheeks flush, but he met the chief's gaze steadily. She needed it more than I did, sir. Tribe. Chief Running Bear turned to address his warriors in their native language. The response was immediate and surprising. Every single warrior dismounted from his horse and knelt in the snow. Thomas had never seen anything like it. 700 of the fiercest warriors on the Great Plains, all kneeling in honor of a 12-year-old farm boy. They honor you, Chief Running Bear explained. Not just for saving my daughter, but for the spirit in which you did it. You saw not an enemy, but another human being in need. Ayana, who had been growing stronger as the morning progressed, stepped forward. Father, I must tell you something. She spoke in English so the Mitchell family could understand. I was wrong to run away. I was selfish and foolish, but Thomas showed me what true courage looks like. He risked everything to help a stranger. Chief Running Bear nodded gravely. The storm that nearly took your life has taught us all something valuable. He turned back to John Mitchell. Your son has honored our people with his kindness. We will not forget this. What happened next amazed everyone present. Chief Running Bear signaled to his warriors, and they began to move with purpose. Some headed toward the forest and returned with fresh game they had hunted. Others produced beautiful handmade items from their packs. Within an hour, a feast was being prepared in the snow outside the Mitchell farmhouse. The chief explained that his people wanted to honor the Mitchell family with a celebration. In our culture, when someone saves the life of a chief's daughter, they become family, he said. You are now under our protection for all time. Thomas watched in wonder as warriors who had seemed so frightening just hours earlier laughed and shared stories around the fires they had built. Ayana, wrapped in his grandmother's quilt, translated conversations between the two cultures. The language barrier seemed to melt away as people shared food and friendship. One elderly warrior approached Thomas carrying a beautiful bow made from the finest wood and decorated with intricate beadwork. Through Ayana, he explained that he had crafted it himself and wanted Thomas to have it as a symbol of respect. I can't accept this, Thomas protested. It's too valuable. Chief Running Bear smiled for the first time since arriving. Now you understand how Ayana felt about your quilt. But gifts given from the heart must be received the same way. As the celebration continued, Thomas learned more about Ayana's story. She had indeed run away during the storm to avoid an arranged marriage, but her time near death had given her a new perspective on life and her responsibilities to her people. I will return to my tribe, she told Thomas. But I will ask my father to let me choose my own husband when I am ready. Your kindness showed me that I should face my problems with courage, not run from them. The feast lasted well into the evening. John and Mary Mitchell found themselves welcomed as honored guests among people they had once feared. Thomas's younger siblings overcame their initial shyness and were soon playing games with some of the younger warriors. As the celebration wound down, Chief Running Bear made an announcement that would change the Mitchell family's life forever. From this day forward, he declared, the Mitchell family is under the protection of our tribe. Any who would harm them will answer to us. They are welcome in our villages, and we will always be welcome at their table. But the chief wasn't finished. He called several warriors forward, and they presented the Mitchell family with gifts beyond anything they could have imagined. There were warm furs for the winter, beautiful pottery made by the tribe's artisans, and enough preserved meat to last through the remaining harsh months. Most remarkably, the chief assigned 2 young warriors to help John Mitchell expand his farm come spring. You saved my daughter, he explained. Now let us help you build a better life for your family. As the warriors prepared to leave the next morning, Ayana approached Thomas one last time. She was still wrapped in his grandmother's quilt, and she looked much stronger after a night of rest and proper food. I will treasure this always, she said, touching the quilt gently. But more than that, I will remember the lesson you taught me. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from gentleness. Thomas felt tears in his eyes as he watched his new friend prepare to leave. Will I ever see you again? Chief Running Bear overheard the question and answered for his daughter. Every year when the snows melt We pass through this territory on our way to summer hunting grounds. We will always stop here to visit our friends. And that is exactly what happened. For many years after that magical winter, Chief Running Bear and his tribe would visit the Mitchell farm each spring. Thomas and Ayanna grew up as friends across two cultures, and their story became legend among both the settlers and the Native American tribes of the region. The friendship forged that winter helped prevent numerous conflicts between settlers and Native Americans in the area. Chief Running Bear often used Thomas's story as an example of how people should treat one another, regardless of their differences. Thomas kept the beautiful bow he had been given for the rest of his life, and eventually passed it down to his own children, along with the story of how kindness can bridge any divide. Ayanna eventually did marry for love, choosing a warrior from a neighboring tribe who shared her values of compassion and understanding. The quilt that had saved Ayanna's life became a sacred object in her tribe, passed down through generations as a symbol of the power of selfless love. And every year when winter's bitter cold threatened the prairie, people would remember the story of a 12-year-old boy who gave away his most precious possession to save the life of a stranger. In later years, when Thomas had become a successful farmer and respected member of his community, people would often ask him about that remarkable winter. He would always say the same thing: "I just did what anyone should do when they see someone suffering. I never expected anything in return, but I received friendship that lasted a lifetime." The story of Thomas Mitchell and Ayanna became a powerful reminder that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, simple acts of human kindness can build bridges that last for generations. Sometimes the smallest gesture from a pure heart can change everything, creating bonds of friendship and respect that transcend all cultural boundaries. The 700 warriors who had come prepared for battle that winter morning instead became witnesses to something far more powerful than any weapon: the transformative power of unconditional compassion. And in their own villages, they told the story of the brave young boy who taught them all what it truly means to be strong.